I ended the last session talking about worldview, and of course Genesis 1, Genesis 2 and 3 addresses a lot of worldview issues. Now the danger is that we go and we say, see, this is our worldview. Look, here it is written, this is the right worldview and you have the wrong one. Whether you're talking to, I don't know, a Buddhist or an atheist. But the trouble is that the worldview of the Bible, or of the biblical authors, like I said in the last session, is not our worldview. And we don't come to the Bible with a biblical Christian worldview or a neutral worldview ourselves. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because most of us, we come from a modern world background. I know we have postmodernity right now, but the great narrative has been modern. The questions that we have in our mind when we approach Genesis are very modern questions, and we need to talk about that as well. So even though Genesis addresses worldview, and even though people have questions about where do I come from, where do I go, no Cotton Eye Joe, no hard-boiled philosopher runs around asking questions like this. And most people don't run around with these questions aware of them. But we address them through stories. Stories give us our identity. We hear stories, the stories of the Bible. And with stories, I don't mean fairy tales, but I mean stories. They flesh out the meaning of the words and the meaning of the answers. God introduces himself through stories. You guys got to know each other through stories. You may be told your name, and then you shared something about where you come from, your place of origin, your family, maybe your profession and what you do. And then we learn more about each other when we hear about our likes and dislikes, about successes and failures, about our hopes for the future. And the more you know someone's story, the more you know the person. Or the more you know the worldview, the more you know your environment. We get to know God through stories. It doesn't help anybody going and telling them God is sovereign, God is gracious, God is faithful, because we need to explain what these words mean. And you will notice that two people can talk about the same attributes of God and have very different ideas what it means. So we learn what it means that God is sovereign when we look at the stories and what they describe. How is God interacting? How does God's faithfulness show? How does God's love show? And then we can understand what the words mean. That's the same with worldview questions. So stories tell us what you have to do in order to succeed, what you have to do in order to fail. Through stories we learn cause and effect. We discover the consequences of choices. We learn to see patterns. We learn something about right and wrong. We learn what's most valuable in life and what's least valuable in life, and things like that. And you cannot take a story and then dissect it or squeeze it and say, look, this is the principle. This is actually what you need to know. This is the essence. Forget about the story. The story is not important. That's not how it works. If it would work like this, God would have given us such a tiny manual on what to do and what don't to do, and how to live a moral life. We don't learn like this, we don't remember, and we don't act and behave according to a manual. When we dissect things, we have a corpse, but we don't have life anymore. And God has given us life. This is really, really important also when we look at Genesis, but also when you do a worldview school. If you go out and you say, look, this and this and this and this are the right principles, I'm not sure how much that will help you and how beneficial that will be for the people around you. So what do these stories address? The primary purpose of biblical narratives is not moral instruction, but it is worldview and identity formation. And of course, especially in the first chapters of the Bible. What are some things that are talked about? These stories on Genesis, they talk about where are we? What is real in the world? Where do we find ourselves? So it's questions like, is everything that's important, is reality spiritual? Is the only thing that matters the spiritual world, or does flesh and blood, wood and stone matter? in eternity. Another question that we get answered is, who are we? What is the nature and purpose of human beings? Are we innocent children? Are we food for the gods? Are we here to just have a good time? It answers the question, what's wrong with the world? How do we account for evil and pain? Where does it come from? Is it because we don't have the same opinion? Should we all be one? Is diversity the problem? Is the problem an imbalance between good and evil, or some forces, the dark and the light side of the force? Is there no problem? Do we just have the illusion that it's a problem? In reality, God is in control and everything's fine, even Auschwitz. What's the problem? Is the problem that wealth is unequal distributed? And with that, of course, the question, what is the solution? What hope is there for a better future? Do we need to take from the rich and give to the poor? Is the answer gender equality? Is the answer that we kill all the infidels? Or is there maybe no solution at all? And stories answer the question, what time is it? Where in the storyline are we located? So that could be a question like what Paul addresses, has the resurrection already happened? Is the Spirit is there? Is everything fine? Healing is available for everybody. Heaven on earth has arrived with the death and resurrection of Jesus. Or is there still something missing? Are we just before the rapture and everything will dissolve and everything will go down? Where are we in the story? You know, what is behind us? What is still in front of us? These are all important questions that need to be answered through stories. And the biblical creation narrative contrasts quite a number of worldview issues. If you look at it, you can see it. Atheism, polytheism, animism, materialism, dualism, pantheism, or pure evolution. Sorry, that was a bit too fast. All of these things are addressed and proven wrong when we read the story. But like I said again, you cannot just run around and tell them, look, it's wrong. But we need to understand the meaning of what the Bible says and what it wants to address. We need to know the meaning of words like creation, good, faithful, things like that. And we should not fall for dissecting it. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that we have a problem, and that is that we come from a modern background. And when I say stories, some of you might get already very nervous and say, hey, we're not talking about stories, we're talking about truth, we're talking about facts. Now, we may associate stories with fiction, something that's not true in any historical sense. In the Western world, the kind of truth that carries the highest value is the sort of knowledge that's most respected is not stories, it's not even history, it's science. And we almost tend to think that this is real truth and everything else is inferior or is second best. Many people, including many scholars, who think precisely this about Genesis stories. They may refer to this as just mythology, something that is not historically true. We can say it like this: truth is scientific, is measurable, and everything else is like it's a unicorn. You know, Adam and Eve, the bush, the garden, the snake, the trees. You know, that's just fairy tales. Now the trouble is, and we can have a very skeptical and critical approach to reading the Bible and say, hey, I wonder if we should all take that as it's written. Now the trouble is, many Christians have reacted to this with a very literalistic reading. How should I say this? The problem is that we have the same worldview assumption. So they react very strongly, but they're also influenced by the scientific worldview. Which means in order for the Bible to be true, we need to prove that it's scientifically true, that everything that is written there happened exactly like this. Everything must be fact. There was a real garden, there was a real snake, there were real trees, there was a real flood, there was a real fish that swallowed Jonah. And we spend all our time and energy in proving that the things that are described in the Bible are scientifically factual true. And we have the assumption if it's not scientifically, factually true, then the Bible is not true. And people come with this assumption, they go to university, they might learn some things which makes them doubt the accuracy of the things described in the Bible. And then when they realize that's not true, they say, well, then the Bible is not true. Because also for them, the highest truth and the only truth that counts is a scientific, literally truth. And then we need to prove where the garden was. We need to find the location. We need to prove that there was a talking snake and all these things. And you might think that I say, oh, that happens. That's not where I want to go right now. But I want to really make us aware of our own worldview assumptions that we have. When you believe this in regards to creation, then usually that leads to a young earth theory. Popular date that the earth was created 4004 BC. That was given by Bishop Ussher. He counted together all the numbers from the genealogy and counted them backwards and said these are all scientific numbers. They are exactly, accurately true. Everything the Bible says is accurate. And then we end up there. But then we also end up with really, really high ages. People turn 969 years old. And again, that's a question where we need to say, is it like that or not? People have found Sumerian kings list where the kings became 25,000 years old because they were mighty men. And you express that in ancient literature by giving them huge lifespans. So the question is, were the Sumerian kings even older? Or do we say, oh no, but that's not the Bible, so they were liars. Of course, people never got that old, but because ours is in the Bible and the highest truth is scientific truth, that means the Bible needs to conform to our standard. Otherwise, why regard it as anything serious? So can we not put the modern scientific standard as the only mattering standard for truth and still take something out of the Bible that forms truthfully our identity and our worldview? Jesus told stories that were not scientifically true. He told the story of the prodigal son. And the question is, well, what was his address? Do you know the house number? What was the name of his mother? And nobody knows because he never existed. So does that mean that we don't learn anything from this story? Was Jesus lying to us? Was he playing with us? Or is the story fundamentally true? Can we get true information, true life value and direction? Are the lessons that the story tells are true? And that's questions that we need to ask also about Genesis. And they don't stand and fall with the GPS locations of the Garden of Eden. That's really, really important. And I really want to put that in the beginning. When people ask me and my wife to tell our love story, I gladly do that, but I will not give them accurate information. I will take 3 weeks of dating where we met several evenings and I condense it into one evening. I shorten this story. I try to pick out the relevant facts and condense it a bit. And sometimes my wife sits next to me and says, hey, but this is not exactly how it was. That was on Tuesday. And that actually was in 2 or 3 locations. And then I say, it doesn't matter. And my wife might be the more accurate storyteller, but I'm the better storyteller. Because my goal is not to give you accurate scientific information. My goal is I want to give you the meaning. I want to make a point with the story. I want to tell something about an emotional process, about things where a light went on, things when things happened. And therefore I change it. Now, depending on your measurement, you might say you're a liar. You cannot do this. But I can tell you, very few people want to sit through the whole 2 weeks when I tell accurately how my wife and I fell in love. I hope that makes a bit sense to you. Sorry, this would be the picture concerning the love story. Sometimes people say God paints a different sky every day, and the question is that a truthful statement or not? Of course not. God does not paint with a brush, We know how clouds come about and what causes the colors of the sunset, but at the same time, it's a very true statement. It recognizes that behind the beauties of the sky, there is a God and an ultimate cause and creator. So yes, God paints a different sky every day. And sometimes people show this starry night in a way that reflects that. And you could choose if you want to have a representation through a photograph from Hubble telescope, or you want to have a representation through a painting from Van Gogh. But both are representations. The Hubble telescope picture is not the Starry Night, as the pipe of René Magritte was not a pipe, it was a painting of a pipe. Okay, so that's a long story, but it's a very, very important issue when we want to talk about Genesis. So there are different ways to look at the Bible and read it. One reading is the simple reading, or the naive reading. That sounds a bit too negative, which means many people take the stories as they stand. They don't ask critical questions, they just read it, they take it as truth, and they greatly benefit from this reading. And the stories enable them to live their life and walk with God. The disadvantage is that it leaves us without answers to some critical questions that people ask. Another approach we already talked about is the skeptical and critical one, where we doubt everything, and we don't want to have that. We don't really want to read this way. That doesn't sound so good. And neither, I would suggest, does the literalistic reading, where we need to prove everything with scientific accuracy that is written in the Bible, even if it doesn't seem to make sense at all. Then one other reading way that you could read the Bible and read Genesis is the literary and theological reading. And I want to focus most about this when I talk now. It takes the book seriously in its type of literature as art, and it tries to hear the theological message, keeping in mind the original worldview and setting of the authors, and says, with that as a background, what does the author want to tell us? And of course it assumes that there's truth in what is written, just maybe not scientific truth. And the last reading way is the synthetic or holistic reading. And this reading also takes the literary and theological dimension of the text seriously, and at the same time considers other fields of inquiry and knowledge, like looks at the science, looks at the data, looks at the age of the earth, of stones, of other things, and says, how can this be? How can this fit together? How can we make sense of what we see in the world and what we see in the Word? The book of God's words and the book of God's world, they need to fit together. And this is the most difficult way of reading the Bible. It confronts us with the most difficult questions. And sometimes there's no final and complete answer yet. Sometimes we're still waiting for some clues and some hints how we can reconcile this. And the big question for you, and as we go on, is of course, what glasses will you wear? How will you read the text? How will you discover this? And so I want to help you maybe look at Genesis in some new ways and have some new ideas about this text.